We have on set with us today Dr. Marlene Attzs, economist and university lecturer. Dr. Attzs is not new to the set, but she's here again to discuss the recently presented budget, the 5 hours and 13 minutes budget of Finance Minister Colin Imbert. Marlene, it's good to have you on the set again.
Good to be here again, Neil.
Tell us, the theme of the budget was pathways to prosperity. Are we on a pathway to prosperity in this country?
Let me break it down. Let me break down the economist side and the Marlene Attzs side, Citizen Jane side. What the Minister of Finance would have presented, a lot of attention would have been paid going back to 2019, which would have been the pre-COVID. So I think he wanted to use that as his takeoff point because the COVID years were really anomalies, as it were. And then, look, if you go to 2022, the Russia-Ukraine war, because of that geopolitical event, there was an increase in energy prices, and that benefited Trinidad and Tobago. So you would have started to see some increase in revenue accruing to the government from the energy sector. So that was 2022, 2023, and 2024. So in theory, the government has been experiencing some positive rates of economic growth, increases in GDP over and above 2019, which would have been the last quote-unquote normal year. Now, I have to say, and I think the minister was asked whether or not he felt that the prosperity was, people were feeling it, and he responded, yes, I have to disagree. I think people are still grappling with high prices, increases in cost of living. We have the boogeyman of, you know, the pending increase in utility rates, etc. So I don't quite think that that prosperity or what we see as, you know, good signs on the macroeconomic front actually trickling down to people just yet. It will take some time because one of the things that happens, what you purchase in the supermarket, for example, goes through a kind of transmission mechanism. So it has to come in a ship from somewhere, and we've been seeing globally supply chain challenges which have in fact been causing prices to increase, and those prices are being passed on to our consumers. So while things are settling down from an economic perspective in terms of when you look at some of the macroeconomic figures, certainly in terms of economic growth, I don't think, I don't feel, personally, I don't feel that the average citizen is really experiencing that prosperity just yet.
Okay. And there are some who argue that there was a $2 increase in the minimum wage,
right,
for instance,
to public sector
workers.
Yes,
He was
very
specific.
That's
Specific on that. And some people are arguing that that is not enough, that it's insufficient to really do anything for anybody. How do you feel about that?
Yes, it is not something that, you know, the average person would, you know, do a song and dance about, but I think it's what the government could have afforded, and I think it's meant to signal the government's recognition that these persons are at the bottom, they're the barest minimum. So they're your CPEP workers, your URP workers, your MTS workers. I think it's meant to be a signal that we would like to help these persons who are vulnerable, economically vulnerable, and also socially, because persons who fall into that cohort would be those persons who may not have a lot of education. So I take it simply as a signal, and hopefully, as the song goes, better days are coming, so hopefully we'll be able, because the minister was clear to say that he didn't want to increase it across the board because he knows that some SMEs and private sector organizations
there's a knock-on effect
are still reeling from the last increase, last budget that was read, the 2024 budget. So he didn't want to pass it on, but I think it's simply to signal, which is also the case of the 5%
for public sector workers.
For public sector workers and all those other workers who would have negotiated and accepted the 4% in the last negotiating period. So I think it's a signal of the government's intent, but that has to be balanced with what the government actually can afford, because the minister he was at pains to say that the government's wage bill is significant. And you know, when you add on these, they might seem small, when you add on these additional, the $2, the 5%, it is going to cause the wage bill to increase by millions of dollars.
But even as we do that, the Prime Minister telegraphed, for instance, that holds train until 2027.
Yes.
How much tighter can the belts go? And does this budget do anything for the mass of the population in being able to hold the fort until 2027?
Well, let me answer the last part first. I think The budget neither gave nor took away, so I think there was a collective sigh of relief because the Minister of Finance, I don't know if you recall, in June he was the first person to choreograph that we have some challenging times ahead and 2027 is going to be the turning point. And the Prime Minister echoed that in his comments week before last, just before the budget. So the whole strain until 2027 is actually the hopefully the Dragon gas is going to come on board, and that itself is dependent on some of the geopolitical goings on, as it were. In terms of the population, I think there's no other choice. I think there's no other choice, and let it not be lost that we are going into an election season. So I think the government would have been hard pressed to adjust any of the other levers because they want the population to not feel any pain. We don't know what will happen in the mid-year review because the mid-year review that will come up in April or May of next year, some of the geopolitical goings on may have settled by then. So the US elections will take place in November. By then we'll have greater clarity on what is going to be the temperature coming out of Washington, depending on whether the Democrats win or the Republicans. And we will also then have a greater sense of what is likely to be the temperature with respect to Venezuela, which is significant for our 2027 conversation in Trinidad and Tobago. So I think the minister tried to balance all of those things. To me, it was a set of simultaneous equations that he had to solve to get the population in a space where they weren't too disquieted in terms of some of the effects, but he's also challenged in terms of his financial resources and his revenue flows. So he was trying to kind of strike that balance, and I think he struck that balance. But it's left for us to see what happens in the mid-year review.
What happens in mid-year?
Because
there was the expectation that for an election budget,
that's right,
that there would be a lot more goodies being distributed.
And I think that is it. I think that's a traditional. I mean, it's like social media. We're accustomed using a newspaper. Now you do everything on social media. So you say something and in 30 seconds time, it's off. You know, you don't have to wait for the newspaper to be printed. And I think that's what the minister did. The minister sort of strategically, in my mind, gave sweeteners in a different way. It's not the traditional ways. So you're not going to get a reduction on increase in old age pension or an increase in the school grant or an increase in this or a reduction in that. But there was little pain inflicted. The devil is in the details, of course, when the respective line ministers come up to do their presentations as part of the budget debate. But I think the minister was trying, because of its election season and because, you know, we have these, you know, we have a way of traditionally managing these things. But, you know, at the end of the day, I think he struck the balance and the correct notes. There were no discordant notes in terms of, so it caused some little angst strategically among the trade unions, etc., by, you know, giving some people 5%, increasing minimum wage for some sectors of workers. But I think generally there were no notes of discordance coming out of the budget presentation.
And you mentioned strategy. 5 hours and 13 minutes?
Very strategic. Very, very, very strategic.
How so?
I think he wore those of us who had to listen to it, he wore us down. But I think there also is a strategy because now the leader of the opposition is given equal amount of time. So it is left to see how she treats with her contribution, whether she can actually go 5 hours and 14 minutes.
And 14 minutes. What do you anticipate?
Well, I anticipate you've already started to hear some of the conversations coming out from some of my colleagues in terms of analyzing, saying that the budget is pretty much, you know, regurgitation of policies before. And I do think that more could have been said, but I am not a politician, but I understand that there is a balance that the minister would have wanted to strike. I must admit I was surprised when I heard it because I was there waiting for things to talk about. And at the end of it, and I said this to him at a forum after, I was left almost speechless because there really wasn't.
That's rare.
And that's very rare. You know, but I think that the leader of the opposition is going to come out and talk about a lack of transformation, that the budget was really not transformative, that there is no vision in the budget. But I certainly do believe that it is a holding brief until the dust settles and some of the geopolitical issues over which we have little to no control, until we have a greater sense of what is happening there. Because even as the budget was being read, missiles were being launched, which sent energy prices up a bit.
Precisely, and that's the other part of the geopolitics, because we now have this situation in Beirut.
Yes.
You have increased, you know, tension between Russia and former allies, so to speak. Is it that we're going to get another help from
not too
region?
sure. I mean, and you know, we don't want to trivialize what is happening in terms of the wars and the conflicts taking place in those countries, but they benefit Trinidad and Tobago. And the other thing, the other side of it is, depending on what happens in the US elections, if President Trump wins, for example,
former President Trump,
if he wins the election come November, he is going to engage in policies. I don't know his whole suite of policies, but certainly, given that he is courted very heavily by the Texas oil-rich barons, it is likely, and the United States has become a more and more aggressive exporter of oil and gas. We're likely to see the United States flooding the market, and that is going to cause energy prices to be depressed, and that is not going to augur well for Trinidad and Tobago. So a lot is happening, not just in terms of the national budget, but a lot of the geopolitical goings on that can impact on Trinidad and Tobago, and it's left for us to see what happens. Certainly my first point, anything can happen between now and then, but certainly the US elections, I think, are significant for us, both in terms of how President Trump treats with the oil, his oil policy, his global policy in terms of geopolitical policy, his migration policy, and of course how he treats with climate change, which is more than likely going to rubbish if he assumes office in January.
Marlene, we saw in this budget a slight change where health got the highest or the biggest slice of the pie this time.
Yes.
As opposed to national security, where many people felt the bulk of the money should have gone. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think we need to move away from simply looking at the allocations and start to look at the return on the investment. It is no secret that we have a crime situation in Trinidad and Tobago. So it's not just about the amount of money you allocate, or it's not just about the amount of police cars, or just about the amount of recruits that you take in. But what is the return on the investment, whether or not our current national security architecture is appropriate for what we're seeing, whether we're doing the kind of research, whether we have the kind of resources being applied. What is the return, not simply the money value. Health, there have been significant and successive conversations around increase in non-communicable diseases,
yes.
And I suspect that part of that is also to treat with those issues in terms of public education and to provide the resources for the respective health facilities, and of course not to be left out education. But again, even though education got the second highest budget, in the fiscal measures, a lot of programs were identified that fall under the purview. So at the end of the day, it's not just the allocations, but as I said, some of those details, those nuanced details that really give you a sense of what is going to be the final allocation, so to speak, for those different ministries.
And that's a good place to put the final stop on this. But before we go, we want to wish you a happy belated birthday.
Oh, thank you. Yes. Thank you so much.
All the best for your upcoming year.
Thank you, and same to you, and always my pleasure to be here with you.
It's good to have you.